A trash collector, James Carter, in his late 40s, made his usual rounds through the Alpine District, a quiet industrial area on the outskirts of the city. The streets were empty, save for the occasional hum of a passing delivery truck. It was just another early morning shift, until he stopped at the row of metal bins that lined a narrow alley between two large warehouses. James had been doing this job for over 20 years, so he knew the routine. However, something about one of the bins caught his eye. The lid wasn't fully closed and the edges were slightly tilted. He walked over to check it, noticing dark, fresh stains on the ground near the container. The ground looked as if something heavy had recently been dragged across it. With a grunt, he tried to lift the container, but something inside seemed to resist. The weight was unusual, much heavier than the usual waste. Hesitant, but out of sheer habit, James lifted the lid of the garbage container. The sharp smell of damp plastic and decay hit him immediately. At first, he couldn't make out what was inside, but then his eyes locked on something that sent a chill down his spine: a torn plastic bag wrapped in gray tape. His hands trembled slightly as he noticed a woman's hand protruding from the torn plastic, fingers adorned with red nail polish. The sight was enough to freeze him in place for a moment. His heart raced and he immediately backed away from the container. James fumbled for his phone in panic, dialing his supervisor first, then the local emergency services. His mind raced, but his voice was steady as he relayed the details. There's a body in the container. I need help immediately." Within 30 minutes, the Miramar Police Department arrived at the scene. A team of officers immediately cordoned off the area, and forensic experts began to examine the site. Detective Lena Davis, a seasoned investigator known for her sharp instincts, led the team on the ground. As the forensic team moved in, they documented the scene meticulously, taking photographs and analyzing the spilled contents around the container. They measured the depth of the trash inside the bin, noting the resistance when James had tried to tip it. There were signs of heavy packing, tape that was much stronger than the usual industrial-grade adhesive. When the bags were finally cut open, the body of a young woman was revealed. Her face was partially concealed, her features marred by bruising, but the meticulousness of the wrapping left no doubt this had been a deliberate act. Detective Davis turned to her colleagues. "Post-mortem interference," she muttered, more to herself than to anyone else. "This isn't a typical domestic crime." The forensic team carefully examined the body. There were multiple stab wounds on the forearms, indicating defensive injuries. A deep incision ran along the torso, and a strange, horrifying detail became apparent: the heart was missing. The mystery deepened as they examined the outer layers of the packaging, which had been wrapped in thick plastic film and sealed with layers of heavy-duty tape. Despite the damage done to the body, the precision of the packaging suggested the person responsible had knowledge of such things. This wasn't the work of a random criminal. It was deliberate, calculated. While Detective Davis and her team worked on securing the scene, another officer began reviewing nearby surveillance footage. The area was sparsely populated, and only a few cameras had recorded the surroundings. Their focus was on the vehicle that might have dropped the body off. The Miramar police quickly confirmed the presence of the city's surveillance cameras, and with the help of public transportation data, they began to trace back the movements that might lead them to the perpetrator. By the end of the first day, a preliminary investigation began. The body was identified through fingerprints, and authorities began cross-referencing travel records from a recent flight from Portsmouth, where a young woman had arrived on a flight from a neighboring city. At first, there was no immediate information about her identity, but by the evening, the details were being pieced together. The investigation was just beginning, and the authorities knew they had a long road ahead of them. Mira Solis had always been a dreamer. A young woman with big aspirations, she came from Clifton, USA, a small but bustling city known for its vibrant art scene. From a young age, Mira had always been drawn to the world of fashion and modeling, but she wasn't one of those born with a clear path paved before them. Her journey had been filled with long hours of hard work and perseverance, trying to break into an industry that often seemed more like a world of smoke and mirrors than real opportunities. Growing up in Clifton, Mira had a modest life. Her family wasn't rich, but they supported her passion for modeling, encouraging her to build her portfolio from a young age. She worked part-time as a makeup artist, learning the craft while also participating in local photo shoots for small brands. As she got older, she began gaining more exposure, and her social media presence started growing, with hundreds of likes and messages from people in the industry who were intrigued by her potential. By the time Mira turned 23, she had a solid portfolio, but the opportunities were still limited. In early March 2025, Mira received an unexpected message on her Instagram account. The message came from a modeling coordinator representing a well-known agency that operated across the Persian Gulf. The message was professional at first, listing the requirements for their upcoming international campaign. There was an offer to cover her flight and accommodation and to pay for 2 photo shoots with major advertising companies. At first, Mira was skeptical. It sounded too good to be true. The agency claimed they specialized in recruiting models from the U.S., Europe, and Asia, and had contracts with several well-established brands. They offered to send a full contract upon confirmation and promised to take care of all the logistics. After a couple of weeks of back-and-forth communication, where the agency shared photos of successful models and offered impressive pay rates, Mira felt a surge of hope. Despite her initial hesitation, Mira decided to take the leap. Clifton had always felt limiting, and she knew that Dubai, with its growing fashion scene and luxurious lifestyle, could offer her a chance to break into the big leagues. The day she booked her flight, she felt a wave of excitement wash over her. This could be her moment, the chance to step into a world she'd only ever dreamed of. On April 15, 2025, Mira boarded her flight to Miramar, a city that promised everything: glamour, opportunity, and success. She couldn't wait to get started. The first-class seat she'd been given by the agency was a sign that they were serious, and she arrived in Miramar International Airport with anticipation in her heart. She was wearing a light denim jacket over a simple white blouse, with jeans and a small suitcase in tow. Upon arrival, the airport was bustling, but Mira's eyes were focused only on the future. She moved through customs quickly, where her details were verified, and her passport was stamped. There was no indication of anything unusual. Her trip to Miramar felt seamless. She was on a new adventure that she believed would take her career to the next level. At the airport, she was greeted by a man in his mid-40s, dressed casually in a black t-shirt and jeans, who introduced himself as a representative of the agency. He held a sign with Mira's name written on it. He was confident and polite, explaining that her accommodation had already been arranged and that they were going to visit the studio for a fitting session the next day. Mira didn't suspect anything. The man had all the right credentials, and the agency had seemed professional after all. They drove together in a luxury sedan to her apartment in the Marina district, an upscale area known for its towering buildings and stunning waterfront views. The apartment was sleek and modern, exactly what she had imagined a model's lifestyle would be like. It was all too perfect. The man handed her a key card to her temporary residence, a service apartment booked through a short-term rental platform. Everything seemed perfect, and Mira felt like she was finally on the right path. After all, this was what she had always dreamed of: working with a prestigious agency, getting photo shoots with international brands, and living in a beautiful city like Miramar. As Mira settled in, she sent a message to her family back in Clifton. She reassured them that everything was going according to plan and that she was excited to start her new life. She told them she'd keep them updated as always. The conversation ended with a heartfelt goodnight, promising that she'd share her first photo shoot pictures soon. Mira woke up early the next morning, excited to begin what she thought would be her big break. She prepared herself for the fitting session that was scheduled for the day, thinking that it was the first step toward a successful modeling career. As promised, the agency representative, Carlos Pinto, met her in the lobby of her apartment. "Good morning, Mira," he greeted her with a warm smile, his eyes gleaming with confidence. "Today's the big day. We'll head to the studio to start the fitting for the first shoot, and I'll make sure everything goes smoothly." Mira smiled back, feeling reassured. He seemed like a professional, polite, experienced, and most importantly, confident in his ability to deliver on the promises the agency had made. She had no reason to suspect anything unusual. Carlos led her to a sleek black car waiting outside the apartment complex. The ride was short, and Mira admired the views of the city's skyscrapers and palm-lined streets, thinking how glamorous and exciting everything seemed. They arrived at a fashion studio in the downtown district, a modern building with huge glass windows and polished floors. Inside, a team of stylists and photographers were busy preparing for the day's shoot. Mira was introduced to Sophia, the stylist, who immediately took her measurements and began selecting outfits for the first photo shoot. The clothes were trendy, elegant, and precisely what Mira had dreamed of wearing. Carlos stood nearby, occasionally checking his phone or speaking to the crew, but always watching Mira with a level of interest that made her feel like she was the center of attention. "This is just the start," Carlos told her. "We have a lot planned for you, Mira. This first shoot will set the tone for the rest of the campaign, and I'm sure you'll impress everyone." Mira was excited. She had seen professional models talk about their experiences online, and she imagined this would be no different. She felt a growing sense of gratitude toward Carlos for giving her the opportunity. After the fitting, Carlos took her to a nearby cafe by the water for lunch. The cafe was cozy with a view of the sea and modern yachts docked nearby. Mira could see that Carlos was trying to keep the conversation light, offering compliments on her appearance and asking her about her journey to Miramar. He made her laugh with stories about the fashion industry, and soon, Mira felt as though she was not only speaking to a modeling coordinator but also to a friend. As they enjoyed their meal, Carlos leaned forward slightly, his voice softer than before. "You know, Mira, I can tell you've got what it takes to be successful here. But success in this industry isn't just about looks. It's about having the right connections, the right people behind you. And I want to be one of those people for you." Mira felt a flutter in her chest. She had been in Miramar for less than 24 hours, but Carlos's words made her feel like she had a partner in the industry, someone who believed in her when others didn't. The conversation shifted to more personal topics. They talked about their families, their interests, and even shared stories about the places they had traveled. Mira felt herself warming up to him. Carlos Pinto wasn't just a professional. He was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely invested in her success. At one point, he even mentioned how difficult it could be for young models like Mira to navigate such a competitive industry without guidance, making her feel even more comfortable. Later that evening, as they returned to the apartment, Carlos dropped a subtle hint. "Mira, there's a lot more I could help you with. I have a few contacts in high places who could really boost your career here. But, of course, it takes more than just the right looks to make it." Mira felt flattered. His attention made her feel special, and his promise to connect her with influential people in the industry seemed like the perfect next step. Carlos had already organized everything for her first shoot, so she felt secure trusting him with the next phase of her career. After a few more casual chats about the modeling world, Carlos suggested they meet again the following evening to discuss the contract and the details of the upcoming photo shoots. He even mentioned that he might be able to arrange a personal contract that would allow her to work with the top agencies in Miramar. The following day was much like the first, filled with meetings, outfits, and preparation for the photo shoot. However, as Mira spent more time with Carlos, she began to notice something unsettling, though it was subtle. He was always a little too interested in the details of her life. He asked about her personal relationships, if she was seeing anyone, and seemed overly concerned with the idea of her being alone in the city. Yet Mira brushed it off. After all, Carlos was an established professional in the industry, and she assumed his interest was simply about making her feel at ease in a new place. The discovery of Myra's body in the garbage container rocked the city of Miramar, sending shockwaves through local news and social media. Within hours, the Miramar Police Department had launched a full investigation into the mysterious death of the young woman. Detective Lena Davis was assigned to lead the case, her sharp instincts and years of experience making her the ideal person to unravel the layers of this troubling crime. Detective Davis arrived at the scene early, carefully surveying the area where the body had been found. The police had already cordoned off the entire block, and forensic teams were collecting evidence from every angle. The garbage container was still standing, its heavy-duty plastic bags wrapped tightly with industrial tape, the outer layer smeared with dark stains. A fresh trail of blood led from the container to the asphalt, raising immediate questions about the victim's movements before she was disposed of. The forensic team began opening the bags carefully, documenting each layer of packaging with precision. Inside, they uncovered the body of a young woman, her face partially covered but still recognizable despite the disturbing injuries. There were deep cuts along her forearms and defensive wounds indicating that she had fought for her life. The most chilling discovery, however, was the absence of the heart. The body had been horribly tampered with, showing clear signs of post-mortem interference. "I've seen my fair share of crime scenes, but this is something else," said Detective Davis as she stood beside the body, her gaze fixed on the multiple stab wounds and the eerie precision of the mutilation. The forensic experts were careful in their examination. The wounds on the victim's body were consistent with stab injuries from a sharp object, likely a knife. But what puzzled the investigators was the deliberate removal of the heart. It was clear that this wasn't a typical murder or domestic dispute. This crime had been meticulously planned and executed. As the team worked, Detective Davis turned her attention to the outer bags that had been used to conceal the body. One of the bags had a barcode and an item number, clearly visible despite the damage. This was a lead, and the detective knew it. The barcode could potentially trace the purchase of these bags and tape, leading them to the supplier or the person who had bought them. In the first few hours after the body was found, the Miramar police had already begun tracing the victim's movements. The victim was identified as Mira Solis, a 23-year-old woman from Clifton, USA who had arrived in Miramar just days earlier. Her name matched a passenger who had crossed the border on April 15, 2025, arriving on a direct flight from Portsmouth, a city not far from her hometown. The police dug into Myra's background, discovering that she had been recruited by a modeling agency before her arrival. Her social media accounts showed a growing presence in the modeling world, though she hadn't yet gained significant recognition. Myra's phone, found among her belongings at the apartment, contained contact details for several photography studios and agency accounts, suggesting that she had been actively seeking work in the city. Within hours, the police had reached out to the airport authorities and requested CCTV footage from the arrivals area to track Myra's movements. The footage revealed Mira arriving at the airport, looking excited and hopeful. She was greeted by a man in his mid-40s, who was later identified as Carlos Pinto, a man claiming to be a representative of the agency that had recruited her. As the investigation team began to piece together the timeline of Myra's trip, it became clear that there were gaps in the information. According to her social media messages and phone logs, Mira had last communicated with her family on April 17, just 2 days after her arrival. In the final message she sent, Mira told her family that everything was going according to plan and that she had been scheduled for a fitting and photo shoot with the agency's team. But after that message there was no contact. Her geolocation stopped updating and her phone went silent. Concerned, her family had reached out to the Kazakh consulate in Miramar, and the consulate promptly filed a report with the police. From that moment, the case shifted from a missing persons investigation to something much darker. While the body was being analyzed by the forensic team, a partial thumbprint was found on the inside of the tape used to wrap the bags. The thumbprint was in good condition, enough for comparative analysis. This was a crucial lead. Detective Davis requested the forensic lab to compare the print with the fingerprints taken from the rental car used by Carlos Pinto. At the same time, investigators were digging into the barcodes on the plastic bags. The items were traced back to a local retailer in Miramar, a home improvement store that sold construction-grade materials. The store's surveillance footage from April 15 showed a man purchasing the exact same bags and tape, paying with a foreign bank card linked to a virtual account. The account had been registered under a name that did not match Carlos Pinto's. The investigators also tracked Myra's last known movements within Miramar using taxi service data. Surveillance footage from a taxi service confirmed that Mira had taken a ride from the airport to a residential area in the Marina district, a high-end part of the city. The ride was short, and the fare was paid through Myra's credit card. As the days went by, Detective Davis and her team began to unravel more details about Carlos Pinto's background. They learned that he had been renting various service apartments in Miramar, always using short-term rental platforms and never staying in one place for too long. The team had a strong suspicion that Carlos Pinto was operating under multiple aliases. As the investigation deepened, the Miramar Police Department and Detective Lena Davis shifted focus to tracing Mira Solis's movements from the moment she stepped off the plane to the moment she was reported missing. The goal was to establish a clearer timeline of events and piece together her interactions with the people involved in the scam. The first crucial lead came from the CCTV footage at Miramar International Airport. The camera at baggage claim captured a young woman matching Myra's description, walking confidently with a small suitcase and backpack, just as she had appeared in the immigration footage. She was greeted by Carlos Pinto, the man who claimed to represent the modeling agency. Their interaction seemed cordial and professional. There was nothing out of the ordinary in their behavior. But as investigators zoomed in on the footage, they noticed a peculiar detail. Carlos's body language appeared overly confident, as if he was already familiar with the airport. He stood with a certain swagger, looking around the area, as if making sure no one was watching too closely. Mira, on the other hand, appeared unaware, distracted by the busy atmosphere around her, her eyes focused on her phone. This subtle contrast in behavior raised a flag for Detective Davis. Carlos Pinto didn't look like the kind of professional who would greet a young woman arriving for work. He seemed far too comfortable in a situation that should have been a new opportunity for both of them. The next step in the investigation was to track Myra's ride from the airport to her temporary accommodation in the Marina district, a high-end residential area in the heart of Miramar. The police subpoenaed taxi service logs, which revealed that Mira had taken a ride from the airport to the Marina apartments, a popular location for short-term stays. The ride was brief, lasting only about 15 minutes, and was paid for with Myra's credit card. The driver, a man in his 50s named Ahmed, recalled that the two of them had spoken briefly during the ride. Mira had mentioned she was new to Miramar and was excited about her upcoming photo shoots. However, Ahmed also remembered that Carlos Pinto had discreetly paid the fare in advance, saying he would handle the details of Mira's stay in the city. Ahmed didn't think much of it at the time, but in hindsight, the fact that Carlos had taken control of the situation seemed unusual. Detective Davis followed up on this lead by requesting CCTV footage from the Marina apartments, where Mira had been staying. The footage showed Mira checking in, and an apartment manager confirmed that she had arrived with Carlos, who presented a power of attorney and claimed to be acting on behalf of the agency. The check-in details raised more questions. The power of attorney document was suspiciously vague, with no legal address for the agency listed, and it appeared to be a poorly photocopied document. Carlos Pinto had also paid for the apartment using a foreign credit card linked to an account registered under a false name. This discovery was pivotal. It was now clear that Carlos Pinto's actions were not just unethical, they were illegal. The digital forensics team worked tirelessly to extract data from Mira's phone, which was found among her belongings. They found that Mira's phone activity was normal during the first few days of her stay. She had exchanged text messages with her family and friends, updating them on her shoot schedules and the upcoming work with the agency. However, her last message, sent on April 17, was short and confident, just a quick reassurance to her parents that everything was going smoothly. The investigation team then focused on Mira's social media accounts. Her Instagram page, which had gained a moderate following, featured photos from her early modeling shoots, and it seemed that her online presence was slowly growing. However, there were subtle changes in the style of posts in the days leading up to her disappearance. She began sharing more personal selfies and casual photos of herself in the city, posing in front of well-known landmarks, while also tagging Carlos Pinto's agency in her posts. Her captions were increasingly filled with positive affirmations, which at the time appeared to be innocent, but with the benefit of hindsight, Detective Davis wondered if this was another form of emotional manipulation. The last photo Mira posted was on April 17. It showed her standing at a cafe near the waterfront, wearing a bright smile and holding a coffee cup. She had tagged Carlos Pinto in the caption, but there was no geotag attached, and no other agency representatives appeared in the photo. Her caption was upbeat, saying, "Feeling excited for tomorrow's shoot. Thanks to the team for making me feel so welcomed here in #Miramar." Shortly after that post, Mira's phone went silent. Her location services stopped updating, and her phone was no longer reachable. It wasn't until the following day that the police received reports from Mira's family expressing their concern about the sudden loss of contact. Back at the apartment, the forensic team searched the apartment records, focusing on the keycard entry logs. The logs revealed that Carlos Pinto had used the keycard several times after Mira's arrival. He entered the apartment on multiple occasions, sometimes alone, sometimes with a woman who appeared to be Mira in the background of the surveillance footage. But then something strange happened. On April 18, the entry logs indicated that Carlos checked out of the apartment early in the morning without Mira. The apartment was left empty, and the keycard was returned to the reception desk. A search of the security footage from the lobby revealed that Carlos Pinto had left the apartment alone at 5:30 a.m. that day. The footage showed him carrying two large bags, his movements quick and purposeful as he exited the building. Detective Davis's heart sank as she saw the footage. Everything seemed to line up. Carlos Pinto was controlling the situation, and Mira's sudden disappearance wasn't a coincidence. She had been isolated and possibly controlled by someone who knew exactly how to exploit her dreams and ambitions. As the investigation continued to unfold, Detective Lena Davis and her team began to focus more on Carlos Pinto, the man who had initially appeared to be a modeling agent offering Mira a bright future in the fashion industry. As each clue was uncovered, the puzzle pieces began to form a troubling picture, one that revealed a history of deception, manipulation, and exploitation. Carlos Pinto had always maintained a smooth exterior. To the world, he was simply a successful professional in the modeling industry, someone with a network of connections and influence. His charm and confidence had earned him the trust of many, including Mira, but as Detective Davis dug deeper, she uncovered a pattern of behavior that suggested Carlos had been operating under a false identity for years. The investigation team began by tracing Carlos Pinto's past. They quickly learned that his true identity was not as clean-cut as it seemed. Using a false name and various aliases, Carlos had been involved in a series of scams targeting young women seeking careers in modeling. His methods were simple yet effective. He would reach out to aspiring models, offer them all expenses-paid trips, and promise photo shoots with reputable brands. Once they arrived, he would isolate them, making them dependent on him for work, while simultaneously manipulating their trust. Detective Davis's team discovered that Carlos Pinto had operated in several countries, including Miramar, Portsmouth, and Mirage, creating fake agencies to prey on young women. The patterns were disturbingly consistent. In each case, women would be promised modeling contracts, but after arriving in the foreign cities, they would be isolated, their passports often taken away, and their freedoms severely restricted. Many of these women never spoke up, either out of fear or because they had been manipulated into thinking that this was part of their career journey. As investigators examined the financial transactions associated with Carlos, they discovered something that seemed to tie him to a larger criminal operation. Carlos Pinto had been using virtual bank cards registered under various fake names, making it nearly impossible to trace his financial footprint. These cards were used to pay for everything from rental apartments to luxury cars, and even for flight bookings for the women he targeted. It was a calculated system that allowed him to keep everything anonymous and avoid suspicion. One of the most revealing discoveries was a set of bank transfers made by Carlos Pinto from an offshore account. These payments were linked to several other cases involving the recruitment of women for modeling gigs that never materialized. The money, although routed through different accounts, consistently ended up in the hands of people associated with human trafficking rings. The connection was undeniable. Further investigation into his activities uncovered a network of accomplices, individuals who had helped Carlos Pinto run his scams in different parts of the world. They were low-level operatives, people who rented apartments, arranged for transportation, and even handled logistics for the fake agencies. They were careful not to leave a trail, often using disposable phones and anonymous digital accounts to communicate. With this evidence, Detective Davis and her team were able to confirm that Carlos Pinto was not just a solitary predator but part of a larger, well-organized criminal enterprise. His manipulation of Mira was just one instance of a much bigger scheme designed to exploit vulnerable young women in the modeling industry. To get a clearer picture of Carlos Pinto's character, the police sought out witnesses and former victims who had crossed paths with him in the past. These women, some of whom had managed to escape his grasp, revealed disturbing details about his tactics. Mariana, a young woman from South America, shared her experience of being recruited by Carlos 2 years prior. "He seemed so professional at first," she explained. "He promised me a future, fashion shows, advertising contracts. But when I got to the city, everything changed. He controlled every aspect of my life. I couldn't go anywhere without him. My passport was taken and I was told it was just part of the process." Mariana was one of the lucky ones. After a few weeks of growing suspicion, she managed to escape and return to her home country, but not without consequences. Carlos had made her believe she owed him everything, and for months after her return, he kept in contact with her, trying to convince her to come back. Another former victim, Olivia, had a more harrowing story. She was one of the women who had been forced into working for Carlos Pinto in the Mirage district, where his previous scams had been centered. "I couldn't leave," she said tearfully. "He told me if I ever tried to leave, he'd make sure no one would ever work with me again. He was like a shadow always watching. He'd show up at the right moments, make me feel special, then remind me that without him I'd be lost." These testimonies helped investigators understand Carlos Pinto's method. He wasn't just recruiting women for the sake of work, he was controlling their lives, making them feel both dependent and grateful. He knew how to play on their dreams of success, and once he had them in his web, he manipulated their emotions to keep them isolated and under his thumb. Detective Davis's breakthrough came when a former acquaintance of Carlos Pinto came forward with a crucial detail. Leandro, a former photographer, had once worked with Carlos on a campaign in Portsmouth. He described Carlos as a charming, calculating manipulator, someone who used his professionalism to mask his true motives. He revealed that Carlos often boasted about the power he had over young models, explaining how he would use their aspirations to control them. Leandro shared an unsettling story about a night he had seen Carlos with a young woman who looked eerily like Mira. The woman was walking behind Carlos, carrying shopping bags, and they appeared to be having an intimate conversation. Leandro said, "Carlos had a way of making women think he was their savior. But behind closed doors he was keeping them trapped." The pieces were falling into place. Mira had been one more victim in a long line of women who had fallen prey to Carlos Pinto's false promises and manipulations. And with every new detail, Detective Davis grew more determined to bring this scammer to justice. As the investigation into Carlos Pinto deepened, The true extent of his manipulative tactics became increasingly clear. The more Detective Lena Davis uncovered, the more it became evident that Carlos wasn't just running a modeling scam, he was orchestrating a well-planned, calculated emotional manipulation designed to make his victims feel completely dependent on him. Carlos had a natural charm that made him irresistible to the young women he preyed upon. He knew exactly what to say and how to act, putting on the persona of a successful agent with vast connections in the industry. He promised opportunities, glamorous shoots, and luxurious living, but behind the facade was a much darker reality. Carlos was no fool. He understood the power of dreams, especially for young women hoping to break into the modeling world. It wasn't enough for him to simply deceive them with false promises of wealth and fame. His tactics involved isolating them emotionally, making them feel grateful and, more importantly, dependent on him for everything. Building trust, one compliment at a time. From the very moment Mira arrived in Miramar, she was drawn into his web. At first, Carlos was all about the business, discussing schedules, sending her wardrobe details, and introducing her to stylists and photographers. But as the days went by, his attention shifted from business to personal matters. He began to ask about her family, her hopes, and her dreams, offering words of encouragement that made Mira feel like she was more than just a model. She was his project, his discovery. Carlos would often compliment Mira's appearance, telling her how special she was. "You're going to make it far, Mira," he would say, his tone sincere as if he truly believed in her potential. "You've got the look, the drive, the determination. You're different from the others. You don't know how rare that is." At first, Mira didn't think much of these compliments. After all, she had heard similar things from other professionals before. But with Carlos Pinto, the words always came at just the right moment, when she was feeling uncertain, or when a photo shoot didn't go as planned, or when she was just starting to doubt herself. Carlos knew the perfect timing for his praise. It was always reinforced with gentle nudges of encouragement, and just when Mira's self-esteem was beginning to rise, Carlos would ask for something small, an extra favor, a personal conversation, or a suggestion on how to improve her look. Gaining control through isolation. The true danger of Carlos's manipulation, however, came when he began to isolate Mira from the outside world. It started subtly. He suggested she focus solely on her work while in Miramar, saying that distractions could damage her career prospects. He encouraged her to avoid socializing outside of the agency's work-related events, making it seem like all her energy should be directed toward her future success. "He's right," Mira thought. "This is my dream. I should give it all I've got." She began to pull back from her family and friends, responding to messages less frequently and becoming more focused on the agency's demands. But soon Mira realized she wasn't just distancing herself from friends and family, she was becoming emotionally isolated. Carlos had managed to place himself at the center of her world, slowly convincing her that he was the only person she needed. She would confide in him about her insecurities, her doubts, and the loneliness she felt in a foreign city, and he would listen patiently, offering reassurances that she would never have to be alone again. By the time Mira's first photo shoot arrived, she had cut off nearly all contact with her family, save for brief texts and phone calls. Carlos, ever the comforting presence, had assured her that her family would understand once she made it big. "Once you're a top model, Mira, they'll understand why you needed to be focused on your career." The manipulative promises. As the days went by, Carlos began to deepen his emotional connection with Mira. At first, their conversations were purely about work, but over time they became more personal. He asked her more about her family, her hopes for the future, and even her past relationships. Each question seemed innocent enough, but beneath it all, Carlos was carefully building a mental image of Mira's vulnerabilities. One evening, after a long day of shooting, Carlos took Mira out for dinner at a quiet restaurant overlooking the city's harbor. The food was elegant, the conversation flowing smoothly, and Mira felt a warmth in her chest. Carlos spoke about his own struggles growing up, about the sacrifices he had made to get to where he was, and how he wanted to help her achieve her dreams. He spoke as though they were already partners, two people working together for the same goal. "You know," Carlos said, leaning in closer, "most people can't handle this kind of life. The pressure, the loneliness, the constant hustle. But you, Mira, I can see you're built for it. You're special. You've got that rare quality, and I want to make sure you never have to struggle like I did. You won't be alone in this." Mira was touched. She had always dreamed of finding someone who understood her struggle. Carlos was offering that understanding, and for the first time in weeks, Mira felt reassured. She felt as if everything was falling into place. What Mira didn't realize was that Carlos Pinto was not only grooming her for emotional dependence, but he was also setting the stage for his control. His manipulative words were designed to make her believe that her success depended on him, and only him. Without him, she feared that her dreams would vanish. The emotional climax a few days later, during a late-night conversation, Carlos took a step further. "Mira," he said softly, his tone laden with sincerity, "I've seen what you've been through. I know how hard it's been for you. But I need you to understand something. To truly succeed in this business, you need to trust me. Trust me completely." Mira nodded, the sense of gratitude and trust she felt for him growing deeper by the minute. She had already relied on him so much, and now it felt like she had no choice but to believe in him completely. "I trust you," she whispered, her voice filled with both hope and fear. Carlos smiled, sensing victory. He knew at that moment that Mira was completely in his control, emotionally and mentally. She had bought into the idea that he was her only ally in an industry that was cutthroat and cold. And just like that, Mira had fallen into the trap. The emotional manipulation was complete. Carlos Pinto was now the center of her world. As the days passed, Carlos Pinto became increasingly meticulous in covering his tracks. He knew that the police investigation was inevitable, and he had already prepared himself to act quickly when the time came. His manipulation of Mira Solis had been perfect up until this point. He had isolated her, gained her trust, and controlled her emotions. But now it was time to execute the final part of his plan, disposing of her and making it look like nothing had happened. Carlos had carefully calculated every step. After Myra's last message to her family on April 17th, she had essentially vanished from the digital world. Her phone was no longer reachable, and Carlos Pinto knew that the next step was to remove any trace that might link him to her disappearance. That night, around 4 a.m. on April 18th, Carlos entered Myra's apartment once again, this time with a new set of intentions. The keycard to her apartment was still in his possession. He had made sure of that by casually asking for it the day before, under the guise of keeping things organized. Once inside, he moved with purpose, taking careful measures to ensure there would be no evidence left behind. First, he gathered all of Myra's belongings, her phone, passport, luggage, and clothes, and placed them neatly in one of the closets. He didn't want any signs of struggle or panic. Everything had to appear calm, as if Mira had left on her own accord. The apartment was left looking like it was merely awaiting her return. Carlos then turned his attention to the hardest part of his plan, disposing of the body. He had already scouted the location, the industrial alley on the outskirts of Miramar, where large garbage containers were routinely emptied early in the morning. It was a remote area, free from surveillance cameras, and the perfect place to drop off a body without drawing attention. But Carlos didn't want to risk being caught, so he decided to go a step further. He would make sure that the disposal would appear unrelated to him in every possible way. Carlos had already secured special industrial bags, the same type used for construction waste, which he knew could withstand heavy weight. He wrapped Myra's body carefully, using thick plastic wrap and heavy-duty tape to ensure the body wouldn't be discovered too easily. The tape was an important detail. It would serve as his buffer between him and the crime. The plastic bags were generic enough that they wouldn't immediately link back to him. Once the body was wrapped and secured, Carlos placed it in the back of a rented van. He drove to the dumping site, parked the vehicle in a dark corner of the alley, and carefully unloaded the body. At first, the process seemed simple. He had done this before, after all. But the eerie silence of the empty streets and the looming weight of what he had done kept nagging at him. He quickly pushed the body into the garbage container, leaving the scene just as swiftly as he had arrived. Before leaving, Carlos took one last look at the area. The garbage truck would arrive soon to pick up the waste, and by then Myra's body would be long gone. He felt a rush of relief wash over him, but it didn't last long. He knew that the body would eventually be found, but by then his carefully crafted plan would have left no trace of his involvement. The forensic team might be able to identify the body, but as long as there were no clear fingerprints, no direct evidence linking him to the scene, he would be untouchable. But what Carlos didn't realize was that Myra's disappearance had already set off a series of events that would lead to his downfall. The Miramar police had begun their investigation, and the detectives working the case were already making progress. Myra's phone records, her social media accounts, and the surveillance footage were all beginning to point to Carlos Pinto as the prime suspect. The moment Carlos disposed of Myra's body, he thought he was in the clear. He continued to go about his day, even checking in with the agency to ensure everything appeared normal. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something had gone wrong. Mira had been too trusting, too naive. She hadn't questioned his promises, his attention, and his manipulative behavior. But now there was a deep emptiness he hadn't expected to feel. Maybe it was the intensity of the crime, or the suddenness of her disappearance. Regardless, Carlos knew he couldn't afford to make another mistake. Detective Lena Davis and her team had already begun the slow process of piecing together the facts. They had spent hours analyzing Myra's phone, and in doing so, they had found digital breadcrumbs that led them directly to Carlos Pinto. His name appeared on multiple communication threads, and his presence in Miramar was more frequent than initially realized. The surveillance footage from Myra's apartment building and the nearby cafe confirmed his role in the events leading to Myra's disappearance. A few hours after Carlos had disposed of Myra's body, the first piece of the puzzle was dropped into place: a thumbprint on the industrial tape. It was small, almost unnoticed, but enough for forensic experts to make a match. And from that moment, Detective Davis's suspicion turned into certainty. Carlos had thought he could get away with it, but as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that his meticulous planning couldn't account for human perseverance. The Miramar Police Department had just begun to close in on him, and the walls were starting to close in. As the hours turned into days, Detective Lena Davis and her team continued their relentless pursuit of Carlos Pinto. The investigation into Mira Solis's death was no longer just a case of a missing person. It had become a high-stakes criminal investigation that threatened to unravel a much larger web of human trafficking, deception, and emotional manipulation. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, on a Sunday morning when a key witness came forward. A former accomplice speaks out. It was Leandro, the former photographer who had once worked with Carlos Pinto in Portsmouth, who decided to speak up. Over the years, Leandro had distanced himself from Carlos, but the guilt of knowing what Carlos had been up to finally caught up with him. Leandro had been involved in several of Carlos's scams, but he never realized the full extent of the manipulation until he saw what happened to Mira. Leandro reached out to the Miramar Police Department, afraid that the consequences of his silence might be too great. He provided them with key information about Carlos Pinto's operations, detailing how Carlos would recruit young women, isolate them, and use them as pawns in a larger scheme. He described how Carlos had created a network of fake modeling agencies that operated in various countries, including Miramar and Portsmouth, exploiting the hopes and dreams of vulnerable women. "He's a master at this," Leandro told Detective Davis during their interview. "He makes them believe that he's the only one who can help them. He convinces them that without him they'll never make it. And the worst part? He gets them so dependent on him that they don't even know they're trapped." Leandro's information was invaluable. It painted a vivid picture of Carlos Pinto's methods and his ability to exploit young women's vulnerabilities. The most disturbing part of Leandro's testimony was his admission that Carlos had been planning something bigger. Mira Solis wasn't the first victim, and she wouldn't be the last. Carlos had been using her as an example, intending to bring her into a larger trafficking operation. But the authorities didn't know this yet. They needed more concrete evidence. The forensic breakthrough with the new testimony, the police were able to re-examine the evidence with fresh eyes. The thumbprint on the industrial tape was now confirmed to be Carlos Pinto's, linking him directly to the crime scene. The forensic team also analyzed the rental van that Carlos had used to dispose of Myra's body. Forensic investigators found traces of blood in the vehicle's trunk, which was consistent with the injuries Mira had sustained before her death. The breakthrough came when the forensic analysis of Carlos Pinto's apartment revealed a hidden computer hard drive containing documents and files that were eerily similar to those found in other trafficking cases. The files included fake modeling contracts, passport copies, and travel itineraries for multiple women. Some of the names were recognizable, victims from past cases that had been reported as missing in different parts of the world. The digital evidence was damning. It painted a clear picture of Carlos Pinto's exploitation of young women, all under the guise of modeling contracts. But the most alarming find was a contract signed by Mira. It appeared legitimate at first glance, but further scrutiny revealed clauses that gave Carlos total control over her career and personal life. The contract was another tactic to keep Mira trapped, emotionally and financially. Uncovering the network as the digital trail continued to unfold, Detective Davis and her team began to uncover a disturbing connection between Carlos Pinto and several human trafficking rings operating in Miramar, Portsmouth, and other parts of the world. It was now clear that Carlos was not just a rogue agent. He was part of a larger network that exploited young women across international borders. The contacts on Carlos's computer included several aliases, each of which appeared to belong to individuals with ties to organized crime networks. Some of these individuals had criminal records related to trafficking and prostitution rings, while others were known for running sham agencies that sold false promises to aspiring models. Detective Davis immediately contacted Interpol and other international law enforcement agencies to help track down these criminals. The investigation grew beyond the scope of Miramar, and it became clear that the case was part of a larger, interconnected network operating globally. The search for Carlos Pinto with new evidence in hand, Detective Davis and her team moved quickly to locate Carlos Pinto. They knew he wouldn't stay in Miramar for long. As a seasoned criminal, Carlos had a history of moving frequently, changing identities and covering his tracks. The police team traced his last known location to a temporary apartment in the Miramar Marina district, but when they arrived, it was too late. Carlos had already fled. The apartment had been vacated the night before, with no forwarding address or trace of his whereabouts. However, the investigators did find something revealing. Carlos's passport had been left behind. It was a fake document with a different name, but the photo still clearly matched his face. Detective Davis now faced a race against time. With Carlos Pinto on the run and a network of accomplices still operating in the shadows, it was clear that the case was far from over. But now the authorities had a stronger lead and they were closing in on their target. The manhunt for Carlos Pinto escalated. The investigation had grown far beyond Miramar. It had become an international pursuit, with Interpol involved and a global alert issued for his arrest. Carlos Pinto had vanished without a trace, slipping through the cracks in the system he had so expertly manipulated for years. But while he was on the run, his crimes had been uncovered, and the truth was finally coming to light. Weeks passed and the police followed every possible lead. Carlos had disappeared, but the pressure was mounting. Detective Lena Davis and her team refused to let up. They followed the trail of digital evidence, tracking phone numbers, fake accounts, and financial transactions that ultimately led to Paris, France. In a sting operation coordinated with French authorities, Carlos Pinto was finally apprehended. He had been hiding under yet another false identity, using a fake passport and living in an upscale neighborhood under the guise of being a business consultant. But the moment his true identity was revealed, his world came crashing down. Carlos was arrested without incident, but when Detective Davis visited him in custody, he wore a cold, detached expression. The man who had once seemed so confident, so untouchable, now appeared broken. He said little during the interrogation, and when asked why he had done it, he simply shrugged. "It's just business," he muttered, as if ruining lives was a trivial matter to him. The trial was swift but intense. As the evidence mounted, Carlos Pinto's defense was futile. The testimonies of the victims, including Mira Solis's family, were harrowing. The jury listened as the families of the victims detailed the manipulation, exploitation, and emotional devastation caused by Carlos's actions. The survivors who had once been caught in his web bravely testified about their experiences, describing how he had made them believe they were the only ones who mattered, only to use them as pawns in his broader scheme. The courtroom was heavy with emotion as Myra's family took the stand. Her mother, Ana Solis, spoke of her daughter's dreams of becoming a model, how she had always been so full of hope and promise. She described Myra's excitement when she first landed in Miramar, how she had kept in touch with her every step of the way. But in the same breath, Ana spoke of the crushing pain she felt when Mira went missing, and the suffering they endured before finally learning the truth of what had happened to her. "You took her from us, Carlos," Ana said, her voice trembling but firm. "You promised her everything and you took away the one thing she had, her life. You used her, manipulated her, and then you discarded her like garbage." Myra's father, Eduardo Solis, was unable to attend the trial, his grief too overwhelming to bear. But in his place, Ana stood tall, a mother's love and loss driving her to seek justice for her daughter. After days of testimony, the jury deliberated for only a few hours. The verdict was clear. Carlos Pinto was found guilty on all charges: murder, human trafficking, fraud, and conspiracy. His role in the deception of multiple young women, including Mira Solis, was fully established, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was filled with mixed emotions. Some victims' families felt a sense of closure, but others knew that no amount of justice could bring back the loved ones they had lost. Detective Davis, who had worked tirelessly on the case, stood in the back of the courtroom, watching as Carlos was led away in handcuffs. There was satisfaction in knowing that Carlos Pinto would never harm another young woman again. But there was also a deep sense of sadness, knowing that the system had failed to stop him sooner. Though Mira Solis could not be brought back, her story had sparked a movement. Myra's family, along with the survivors of Carlos Pinto's exploitation, worked together to establish a non-profit organization dedicated to raising awareness about human trafficking in the modeling industry. The organization aimed to help young women navigate the dangers of the industry, offering resources on identifying scams, seeking legal protection, and empowering women to speak out against abuse and exploitation. Myra's legacy became a driving force for change. The organization, named after her, became a beacon for those who were too afraid to speak up. Her family turned their grief into a mission, determined to prevent other families from going through what they had suffered. As Detective Davis reflected on the case, she couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility. Carlos Pinto's network had been vast, and his exploitation of young women had gone unnoticed for far too long. But in the end, the truth had come out. The work was not done. There were still other predators out there, operating under different names and in different cities. But the momentum was building. The law enforcement community was more vigilant, and the public was becoming aware of the dangers lurking in the modeling industry. In a final reflection, Detective Davis stood by the window of her office, looking out over Miramar's skyline. Carlos Pinto was behind bars, but his story would continue to haunt her. She had solved the case, but the scars left on the victims and their families would never fully heal. Still, she knew one thing for sure: justice had been served, and for Mira Solis that was something.